Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to the disciples, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with another person in the community, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult another person, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that someone in the community has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to that person, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court together, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that all those who look at others with lust have already committed adultery with them in their heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose a member of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one member of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that any man who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whichever man marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great sovereign. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Beloved people of God, oh my. Whether or not you knew this gospel reading was coming today, it's still a bit of a shock to hear it, isn't it? I think it's perhaps one of the most difficult gospel readings that come to us in our lectionary cycle, because in it, Jesus just seems so harsh. And it's not that Jesus just says one harsh thing either. He says so many of them. There are those threats of hell. There are those wildly hyperbolic, but also just crazy sounding commands to tear out one's eye or cut off one's hand. And then there are those hard, and at least to modern ears, almost inhumane sounding words about divorce. Why, Jesus? Why, oh why, take something that is already so tender and pain-filled and then speak these words that only add to the shame and guilt that people already have? What's going on? Well, taking a really big step back, I think at least part of the reason for the harshness, the intensity here, is that Matthew does kind of want to startle us. I think to make sure that we take Jesus seriously as a teacher of the law, as a teacher of what in Hebrew is called Torah, the commandments. See, according to our scriptures, one of God's great gifts to humanity is this set of holy teachings about how human beings are to live well together upon this good and beloved earth. And Jesus stands in a long line of teachers and prophets who hold up these teachings, these commandments for God's people. You may remember that over the course of these past few Sundays, we've been reading through what is probably Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And what we heard today is yet another piece of that famous sermon. And I don't think it's coincidental that Jesus preaches it on a mountain. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is presented as even a kind of new Moses, giving, teaching, and interpreting the law anew, just like Moses did from Mount Sinai, all those thousands of years before. So I think one reason for the harshness in Jesus' sermon is just to make sure we know that Jesus isn't joking here. When Jesus says in this very same sermon, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill." He's not kidding around. Just as Moses' teaching was accompanied by thunderous flashes of fire as he received God's holy law on the mountain, so Jesus' words contain their own flashes of fire. Listen carefully. Heed these words. Heed this one. I think in part that's what we're supposed to hear. Still, I wouldn't fault anyone for wondering whether Jesus kind of overdid it here. Did he really need to be this harsh in order to get the point across? And here is where I do think it helps to offer some further interpretation of Jesus' words. Because fundamentally, I don't think that what's at the heart of Jesus' teaching is harshness. Not at all, but rather a fierce desire for what our scriptures call righteousness, and also what they call justice, what the theologian Cornel West has called love lived out in public. Maybe we just start with the hardest one, with Jesus' teaching about divorce. Here, Jesus seems to level the harsh judgment of adultery against pretty much every situation in which a marriage is ended by choice. However, it's critical to know that marriage and divorce were very different social realities in Jesus' day than they are in ours. And they're different in at least two really important ways. One is that in Jesus' day, the man held just about all the power in a marital relationship. And in almost every circumstance, only a man would have had the power to call for a divorce in the first place. And the second important thing to know is that in Jesus' day, a woman who was divorced had almost no way of supporting or protecting herself. While a divorced man could freely move on with his life, a divorced woman was almost certainly thrown into poverty and disgrace. Jesus calls such a practice what it clearly is: evil and wrong, a breaking of God's law, of God's loving intention for the world. While divorce in our day can be a dreadfully painful thing, it's also an entirely different thing than the particular evil that Jesus is speaking to here. But then, what of these other teachings of Jesus? They're pretty harsh too. And what can we say about them? One interpreter I read this week was helpful for me. This particular writer noted that in each of these cases where Jesus seems to take the law and make it more harsh, what Jesus is actually doing is showing how expansive and all-encompassing God's law is, in a way that is actually for our profound good. The law of Moses says, "Do not murder." But as this interpreter writes, it's as if Jesus goes on and says, when God gave us this commandment, do you think the idea was that we would form a community in which we constantly antagonize each other, hate each other, abuse each other, wound each other, and then at the very last moment refrain from murdering each other? Of course not. The spirit of "you shall not murder" is that you're bearing towards your neighbors both in your actions and in your dispositions, in your hand and in your heart, should never be enmity. Think of it this way. When you're angry at someone, when you lash out with hateful words, isn't that too, in its own way, a kind of violence, a lesser form of murder? This seems to be what Jesus is aiming at when he says that even when we are angry with one another, then we will be liable to judgment. Because while this is not true of all anger, which can at times be focused in powerful ways toward the good, it is true of a lot of anger, which can, left unchecked, simply feed on itself, leading to ever more enmity, ever more hate, even ever more violence. Jesus knows that we need less of all of that in the world, and so he shows us how the commandments point in a different direction. And then Jesus goes on to interpret, "You shall not commit adultery," in a similar way. Again, this commentator writes, it's as if Jesus says, when God gave us this commandment, do you think the idea was that we would form a community in which we constantly leer and lust after each other, objectify and sexually pursue each other, and then at the very last moment refrain from adultery? Of course not. Jesus' interpretation of the commandment, "You shall not commit adultery," would have us turn aside from a whole range of ways in which we humans allow our desires to hurt and demean one another. And then, this is significant too. I really don't think it should be overlooked that in this passage, Jesus is going against a really strong cultural grain that puts the problem of lust upon the appearance of those being lusted after, blaming, in so many cases, women for how they look or how they're dressed. But Jesus zeroes in here on the one who is doing the looking. In the original language, it's clear that Jesus is talking to men and telling them in no uncertain terms that they are indeed responsible for their gaze. So then, having covered an awful lot of ground here, what is it that ties all of these teachings together? What is it for Jesus that lies at the heart of his teaching about God's commandments, at the heart of God's desire for human life? It seems to be this: a fierce desire that we humans live out our lives in love. That we, as Cornel West would say, live out that love in public, tending to the work of justice, justice for all, but most especially for those who are oppressed. And at the same time, Jesus makes it clear that God's desire that love would rule our lives is not just for our public lives, but also for our inner lives, where God would have even our innermost thoughts be of love for ourselves and for one another, because all of it is connected. We cannot hate ourselves or one another and then live as God intends. We cannot denigrate each other in our inner thoughts and then be nice to each other and think all is well. Nor can we think pious, loving thoughts, but then live in blatant injustice and pretend we're right with God or the world. It is impossible. It's all of a piece. Later in his ministry, Jesus will sum up the whole of the law and the prophets like this: "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." It is all summed up in love. Love that fills our hearts, souls, and minds, and love that fills the world with justice and good for all our neighbors, human and non-human alike. The trouble is, of course, how to do this. It's one thing to command it, and it's entirely another for it to be done. And there is surely no end to the reasons we could find to despair of it ever being done out there in God's beloved world or in our own hearts. However, I was taken this morning with another little line from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It's one that our choir actually sang as we were preparing to hear the gospel. Did you hear it? They sang, "You are the light of the world." Not you must be, you need to be, you better be. No, simply you are. The kind of promise that the love we're talking about here is a gift. It is grace. It comes to us. You are. It's like the Apostle Paul writing to the Corinthians, it is God who gives the growth. The love that Jesus commands is the very same love that Jesus pours out on the cross. It's the love that washes over us in baptism, that feeds us at the table. Paul even uses the beautiful image of a mother's milk. God is like that, tenderly feeding us. Every day, God pours out such gifts for us, holding us, feeding us, forgiving us, healing us, and setting us again on this path of love. No, in and of ourselves, we cannot live as Jesus commands. And yet the promise is sure. You are the light of the world. You are. O Jesus, heal us, that we might truly live in your unending love. Amen.